There is a hill in northern Georgia where, on a September afternoon in 1863, one man refused to move while an entire army came apart around him. Behind him, 30,000 Union soldiers were running. Wagons overturned in the road. Officers shouted orders no one obeyed because there was no order left to give. A whole wing of the army had dissolved. Not retreated, dissolved. And the men who could still run were running north, toward Chattanooga, toward anywhere the guns weren't. The commanding general was already gone, swept up in the flood of his own fleeing men, riding away convinced the battle was lost and his career finished with it. And on that hill, on a slow horse, sat a heavy-set, gray-eyed Virginian watching the ruin pour past him and deciding, quietly, the way he decided everything, that he was not going to leave. He gathered the pieces of shattered regiments as they stumbled toward him out of the smoke. Men who had lost their units, their officers, their nerve. He set them in a line along the high ground, one broken fragment at a time, the way you build a wall out of rubble. And for the rest of that long afternoon, against wave after wave of Confederate assault, with the cartridge boxes running empty and the bayonets coming out, he held. He held until the sun went down. He held until every soldier who could be saved had gotten away behind him. He saved the Army of the Cumberland that day. Historians have since called it one of the greatest defensive stands in the history of American arms. The men who were there never forgot it, and they gave him a name that afternoon that would follow him to his grave and beyond it, the Rock of Chickamauga. Now here is the strange part, the part almost no one knows. If you had walked into a certain parlor in his home state of Virginia in the years after that battle, the house where he was born, where his own sisters still lived, you would not have found his portrait hanging on the wall. You would have found it turned around, face to the plaster, turned by his own family, who had decided, and would decide until they died, that he no longer existed, that they had no brother by that name. How does a man become both a legend and a ghost? Hold that question. It's the whole story. Here are the two questions this film exists to answer, and they are strange ones to ask about a man this good. How does a soldier save an entire army, win some of the most complete victories of the whole Civil War, and still end up half forgotten, his name at the bottom of the list of great generals, behind men whose records were no better than his and often worse? And how does that same man lose his family, his homeland, and his place in his own state's memory, not for doing something wrong, but for doing something right? The answer to both is the same, and it's the saddest kind of answer there is, because George Henry Thomas had one flaw, if you can even call it that. He would not sell himself. He did the work, and he let the work speak, and he assumed, the way honest men assume, the way that gets honest men forgotten, that the truth would be enough on its own, that if you saved an army, people would remember who saved it, that if you did your duty at a terrible price, the price would be honored. He was wrong. Wrong in a way that cost him a permanent place among the immortals. And this is the story of how and why. It's a story about the difference between earning something and getting credit for it, about a man who chose his oath over his own blood and paid for that choice every day for the rest of his life. And underneath it, one hard truth that has nothing to do with 1863 and everything to do with the world you're living in now. That history is not a fair scale. History is written by the men who demand to be in it, and the ones who never demand, the ones who just do the work and go home, get quietly written out. All George Thomas ever wanted was to do his duty and be trusted to do it. Keep that in your mind, because you're going to watch him do the duty, better than almost anyone in that war, and you're going to watch the trust and the credit flow past him to louder men again and again. Before we go on, thank you for being here and for caring about the men history overlooked. If this story means something to you, a like helps it reach the people who'd care too. Now let's go back to the beginning, to a Virginia farm, and to a boy who would one day be forced to choose between everything he came from and the one thing he believed was right. George Henry Thomas was born in the summer of 1816 in Southampton County, Virginia, deep southern country, flat tobacco land in the southeastern corner of the state. His family were planters, landowners, slaveholders, respectable, rooted in that soil for generations. Everything about the world that produced George Thomas pointed one direction, and it was the exact opposite of the direction his life would take. He grew up quiet, and he grew up careful. Not slow of mind, careful. There's a difference, and almost no one who dealt with George Thomas ever learned it, and that failure would haunt him at the highest levels of the army. As a child, he watched a thing all the way through before he touched it. He'd rather be right on the second try than wrong on the first. In a culture that worshipped the bold gesture and the quick temper, young George Thomas was already something else. Deliberate, steady, immovable once he'd decided. The tortoise, born into a country full of hares. There's a story from his boyhood that tells you who he was. In 1831, when George was a teenager, Nat Turner's rebellion broke out. In Southampton County, the very place the Thomas family lived. And the family had to flee their home in fear. And it's said that even as a boy, Thomas came out of that terror not with hardened cruelty, but with a quiet, lifelong discomfort with slavery itself. A discomfort he never made speeches about. But that sat in him, and that maybe, years later, made the impossible choice a little less impossible. He kept his own counsel. He always kept his own counsel. In 1836, he went to West Point, and here plant something, because it comes back. The men Thomas sat beside in those classrooms, and the younger cadets he'd soon teach, were the very men he would one day command, and one day destroy across a battlefield. William Tecumseh Sherman was a classmate, and became a friend for life. When Thomas returned to West Point as an instructor of artillery and cavalry, the young men learning to sit a horse under his patient eye included cadets who would ride against him in Confederate gray. Among them, a flamboyant young Virginian named J.E.B. Stuart, who idolized his instructor. Thomas taught these boys the trade of war. And then the country broke, and he met some of them again under the worst circumstances a teacher can imagine. On the other end of the guns he'd taught them to load. It was there, teaching cavalry, that he earned the nickname that would shadow his whole career and nearly end it. Because of an old back injury and a temperament that refused to hurry, he rode at a measured, unhurried pace, and the cadets called him Slow Trot Thomas. It was fond. It was also, though no one meant it that way, a prophecy. That word, slow, would be picked up years later by impatient men in Washington who mistook his care for hesitation and his thoroughness for cowardice. He went to war for the first time in Mexico, and there he did what he would do on every field for the rest of his life. Solid, unspectacular, reliable work under fire. He earned brevets for gallantry, and he collected almost no attention doing it, because he never once pointed at himself and asked anyone to look. That was George Thomas by his mid-40s. A professional soldier with 2 decades in uniform. A Virginian to the marrow. Married. And mark this, because it matters enormously at the end. To a northern woman named Frances, from Troy, New York. A man with a spotless record, the deep loyalty of everyone who served under him, and no talent at all for the one skill that builds a reputation, talking about himself. And then, in the spring of 1861, the country split down the middle, and George Thomas was handed the hardest choice a man in his position could face. To betray his country, or to betray his own blood. Understand exactly what secession meant for a man like Thomas, because this is the wound the entire rest of his life bends around. He was a Virginian, not by accident of a map, but by every tie that can bind a human being to a place. His aging mother was there. His sisters, the women he'd grown up beside, were there. The land his family had worked for generations was there. When Virginia left the Union in April of 1861, nearly every officer of Southern birth faced this identical fork, and the overwhelming majority chose the path Thomas's whole life pointed toward. Robert E. Lee offered command of the Union armies, agonized, and chose Virginia. Joseph Johnston chose the South. Stuart, the cadet who had idolized him, chose the South. To go with your state was the expected thing, the honorable thing as the South understood honor, the thing that kept you welcome at your mother's table. Thomas went the other way, alone. He had taken an oath to the United States, and he decided the oath meant exactly what it said. Not the state, the nation, not blood, the flag he'd sworn to. It was not a loud decision. He gave no speech. He simply informed the army he was staying and reported for duty, and by that one quiet act, he detonated his entire personal world. His family in Virginia never forgave him. Not for one day. Not for the rest of their lives. By the accounts that have come down to us, his sisters took his portrait down off the wall and turned its face to the plaster so they wouldn't have to look at it. They returned his letters unopened. In later years, when he tried to send money home, they refused to touch it. When neighbors asked after their brother, the famous general, they answered, flatly, that they had no brother. The name George was struck out of that house as thoroughly as if he had died, and in every way that mattered to those women, he had. He would never see Virginia again except as enemy country. He would never sit at that table again. This is the ghost. This is the thing that haunts every battle you're about to watch him fight. George Thomas did the hard, lonely, principled right thing at the highest personal cost a man can pay. And he did it quietly, expecting nothing. Not applause. Not gratitude. Not even understanding. He surrendered his family and his homeland to keep his sworn word, and then turned around and marched off to fight against the very people he had lost everything for. Carry that into every field that follows. This is a man who had already sacrificed more than most soldiers would in the entire war, before he fired a single shot. In January of 1862, at a rain-soaked crossroads in Kentucky called Mill Springs, George Thomas won the first significant Union victory of the war in the West. And it made almost no one famous, least of all him. Almost nothing he ever did made him famous, and the reason is the same every time. He won at Mill Springs the Thomas way. Careful preparation, nothing left to luck, a cool head when the fighting swung close. He beat the Confederates soundly, and he did it without a shred of drama, without a stirring quote for the newspapers, without a single gesture crafted to be remembered. He won, cleanly, and turned to the next problem on the map. His soldiers came to love him with a devotion that's genuinely rare. They called him Pap Thomas. Pap, as in father. And they meant it. Because unlike the glory hunters who spent men's lives cheaply to buy a headline, Thomas was almost fanatically careful with the lives of his men. He would not attack until he was ready, because attacking before you were ready got your soldiers killed for nothing. He drilled them, fed them, armed them, and spent them only when the spending would count. And the men knew it. Soldiers always know. They'd have followed him into hell, because he'd earned it the only way it can be earned. But look at the pattern setting in, because it's the shape of the whole tragedy. This was a war being narrated in the newspapers back east, turned into legend even as it was fought. And the men who got written up were the bold ones, the dashing ones. The ones who lost a battle spectacularly and gave a stirring interview about it, or won one and made sure a reporter was standing close. Thomas did neither, ever. He won quietly and took no bows. And a man who wins quietly and takes no bows, in a war being spun into mythology in real time, slowly becomes invisible. Not because he did less, but because he said less. By the late summer of 1863, Thomas commanded a corps in the Army of the Cumberland under a brilliant, erratic general named William Rosecrans. And that army was marching straight toward the two worst days of its existence, toward a sluggish creek in the dense Georgia woods whose name, in the old Cherokee tongue, is said to mean the River of Death. Chickamauga. The battle opened on the 19th of September, 1863, in country so thick with trees that men could barely see the enemy they were firing at. Two great armies groped for each other, blind in that forest, and the first day ground on bloody and inconclusive. Both sides hammered, neither broken. The catastrophe came on the second day. And, as catastrophes do, it came from a simple mistake. In the confusion, Rosecrans received a report, an incorrect one, that there was a gap in his line. To close a hole that didn't exist, he pulled a division out of the very spot where, a moment later, the hole became horribly real. For a few minutes, there was a genuine quarter-mile gap torn open in the center of the Union line, an open door standing wide in the middle of a battle. And standing directly in front of that door, by the purest and most terrible chance, was the massed assault column of James Longstreet, sent west from Lee's army with his hardened veterans, arriving at the worst possible moment for the Union. Longstreet's men poured through the gap like a flood through a broken dam. The Union right didn't bend. It disintegrated. Whole regiments were swallowed and swept away, and the panic ran faster than the bullets, until a third of a great Union army had stopped being an army and become a terrified mob streaming for the rear. And in that flood went the high command itself. Rosecrans was caught in the rout and swept north with the fleeing mass, cut off from the half of his army still fighting. He rode all the way back to Chattanooga, convinced his army had been destroyed. The leadership of the Army of the Cumberland was, in an hour, gone from the field. But the other portion of that army had not run, and it had George Thomas. Thomas commanded the Union left, and the left had held when the right collapsed. Now he did the thing that made him immortal. Instead of joining the retreat, instead of the entirely defensible choice to save himself and get out, he pulled his men back onto the high ground behind the Snodgrass farm, a wooded rise called Horseshoe Ridge. And there, calmly, in the middle of a total disaster, he began to build a new line out of pure wreckage. Broken regiments, lost stragglers, men who had lost their units and their officers and were wandering the smoke, looking for anyone still standing and giving orders. Thomas took all of that human debris and forged it, piece by piece, into a wall along the crest. And then the Confederate army turned its full weight on him. They came, and they came, and they came again. Hour after hour, through the whole afternoon, the victorious Confederates hurled assault after assault up those slopes, certain that one more push would shatter this last knot of resistance and complete the annihilation of the entire Union army in the West. And every time, the Rock held. Thomas rode his lines slowly. That same measured pace the cadets had teased him for, and everywhere his calm passed, frightened men steadied and found they could stand. The cartridge boxes ran dry. Still, they held. With the bayonet, with clubbed rifles, meeting each charge at the crest and heaving it back down the bloody slope. Late in that terrible day, when the ammunition and the daylight were both running out, help came from an unexpected direction. Union reserves under Gordon Granger, posted miles away and under no orders to move, had sat listening to the swelling roar of the battle, and Granger, on his own authority, marched his men straight toward the sound of the guns. They arrived on Thomas's flank at the breaking point, bringing fresh troops and desperately needed ammunition. It was barely enough. The ridge held through the last assaults of the fading light. And when full darkness fell, George Thomas did the hardest thing of all. He didn't just survive. He conducted a controlled, orderly withdrawal in the dark, drawing his men off that ridge unit by disciplined unit, in good order, and marching them safely to Chattanooga. Not a rout. A calm, professional retreat by an army that, thanks to one man, still existed. He had held the line long enough for the entire rest of the Army of the Cumberland to escape. An army that, by every rule of that afternoon, should have been destroyed to the last man. That army lived. Because one heavy-set Virginian on a slow horse looked at the ruin of everything around him and decided he would not leave that hill until his men were safe. That is the afternoon they named him, the Rock of Chickamauga. One of the greatest defensive stands in the history of American arms. And now watch, very carefully, what happens to the credit for it. Chickamauga was, on the plain arithmetic of the ledger, a Union defeat. The army had been driven from the field. And when a battle goes into the books as a defeat, the story told afterward is a story about two things, blame and salvage. And somehow both of them kept turning out, in the telling, to be about other men. Rosecrans, swept off the field in the rout, was relieved of command. That much was fair. But the deeper truth of the day, that the army existed at all only because George Thomas had stood on that ridge when he had every right to run, took years to fully register in the public mind, and in some quarters never entirely did. The stand was known. It was admired by those who understood war. But Thomas would not climb onto a stage and describe it, would not write the thrilling account, would not campaign for the glory. And so the fame the deed had earned came to him slowly and thinly, always a little less than the deed deserved. Thomas was given command of the very army he'd saved and ordered to hold Chattanooga, where the Union force was now besieged, ringed by Confederates, holding the heights, and slowly starving. When the order came to hold the town at all costs, Thomas sent back a reply that tells you everything. He said, in effect, that they would hold the town until they starved. No drama. Just a fact and a promise, and for Thomas the two were always the same. Then Grant arrived to take overall command in the West. The siege was broken, and in November of 1863 came the Battle of Chattanooga, and one of the most astonishing moments of the whole war. And even this, which his own men would author with their bodies, the credit would slide sideways off of Thomas. The plan called for his Army of the Cumberland to make a limited attack, take the Confederate rifle pits at the base of Missionary Ridge, and stop there. His men, the men of Chickamauga, took the rifle pits, and then, without orders, on their own, boiling over with something between fury and wounded pride, these were the men who'd been branded, defeated, who carried a score to settle. They kept going. They charged straight up the impossibly steep face of Missionary Ridge, a slope so sheer the generals watching gasped, certain it was suicide, into the teeth of the entrenched Confederate line at the crest. And they broke it. They shattered the center of the Confederate army and sent it running. It was one of the most dramatic assaults ever made by American soldiers, and it was made spontaneously by the Rock's own army. The men everyone had written off. Grant, watching that impossible charge from the valley floor, was stunned, and, by the accounts, not entirely pleased. He turned and demanded to know who had ordered those men up the ridge. No one had. They had done it themselves. Because they were the Rock soldiers, and they had a reputation of their own to reclaim. Do you see the pattern? Thomas saves an army at Chickamauga, and the fame trickles in slow. Thomas's men achieve the impossible at Missionary Ridge, and the commanding general's first reaction is to demand who's to blame for it. This man and the soldiers who loved him kept doing extraordinary things, and the extraordinary things kept getting filed under someone else's name. But the deepest cut was still coming, and it would come from the top. In the closing months of 1864, the war in the West rushed toward its climax, and George Thomas was handed the job of finishing it. Sherman marched off across Georgia toward the sea, cutting loose from his supply lines, and left Thomas behind to handle the one great remaining danger: the Confederate Army of Tennessee, now under John Bell Hood, another man who had passed through West Point in Thomas's era. But Hood was everything. Thomas was not. Reckless where Thomas was careful, willing to spend his soldiers like water. And Hood was driving north with what remained of Confederate strength in the West, aiming to smash into Tennessee, retake it, and perhaps reverse the course of the war. Thomas gathered his forces at Nashville and did what he always did. He prepared. Methodically. Completely. He would not attack Hood until his cavalry was properly remounted and his army fully ready, because a half-ready attack got men killed for nothing and let a cornered enemy escape. And he didn't just want to defeat Hood. He wanted to destroy him, to end that army forever. And destroying an army, rather than shoving it backward, takes patience. It takes time. And here we have to be honest about the man on the other end of this. Not Hood, but Grant, far away in Virginia, growing more furious by the day. Because Grant was not a fool, and his impatience was not villainy. Give him his argument, because it was a real one. From where Grant sat, the war was a race against the clock. Every day Hood's army survived intact was a day it might slip away, be reinforced, or lunge at some vital point and undo everything. Grant had learned his hardest lesson in blood. The way to win was relentless pressure, never letting up, never giving the enemy the gift of time. And now here was Thomas, sitting apparently motionless at Nashville, not attacking, sending back terse wires saying he needed more time. To Grant, 300 miles away, that looked like exactly the thing his whole strategy existed to prevent. It looked like fatal slowness. It looked like slow-trot Thomas, dawdling while a dangerous enemy got away. Grant was wrong, completely wrong, as it turned out. But you can see why he believed it, and that is what makes this a tragedy between two able men rather than a story of a fool and a hero. And then a great ice storm swept over Nashville, sheathing the hills in glass, making any attack a slaughter of men slipping and falling on frozen slopes. Thomas waited it out. He would not send his soldiers up a glazed hillside to die for a schedule. And to a frantic Washington, the silence from Nashville became unbearable. Grant ran out of patience. He drafted the order relieving George Thomas of command. He dispatched another general, John Logan, to Nashville to take the army out of his hands. And then, still not satisfied, Grant set out from Virginia himself to see it done. The axe was in the air, inches from the neck of the man who had saved the army at Chickamauga. And then the ice began to melt. And on the 15th of December, 1864, before Logan could arrive, before Grant could reach the city, before the order could take effect, George Thomas attacked. What followed was not a victory. The word is too small. It was an annihilation. Over 2 days at the Battle of Nashville, Thomas fell on Hood's army of Tennessee and destroyed it. Not defeated it, destroyed it. In one of the most complete and decisive victories won by any general on either side in the whole war. Hood's army, one of the two great Confederate field armies, effectively ceased to exist. It was shattered so thoroughly it never seriously threatened anyone again. He had been right about every piece of it. The patience, the preparation, the waiting out of the ice. Every deliberate choice that had looked like weakness from a distance had been exactly correct, and the proof lay scattered across the frozen Tennessee hills in the wreckage of a destroyed enemy army. He had won the argument in the most complete way a soldier can. Days before he'd have been fired for being too slow, he delivered a faster, cleaner, more total kill than any of the men who doubted him ever managed. And yet the full trust never quite came. The doubt was on the record now, permanently. In the drafted order, in the replacement already on the road, in Grant himself traveling to fire him. The man had come within a day of being stripped of command for the crime of being about to win overwhelmingly. And that, more than anything, is the wound of George Thomas's career. Not that he ever failed. He didn't. But that he succeeded, magnificently, over and over, and was still, to the end, never quite believed. So let's finally ask the question this whole story has been circling. Why is George Thomas not a household name? Why? when we list the great Union generals. Grant, Sherman, Sheridan. Does his name come last? Or as an afterthought? Or not at all, standing forever a half step behind men whose records, measured honestly, were not one bit better than his, and often worse? The answer is everything you've just watched. He would not promote himself. That's the whole of it. In a war where reputation was built by the men willing to build it, who wrote the letters, courted the reporters, shaped the story while it was still wet, Thomas refused to play. He believed, with a stubbornness that was equal parts nobility and self-destruction, that the work should speak, that saving an army should be enough to be remembered for saving an army. And when the guns fell silent and the great men sat down to write their memoirs, to shape forever how history would see them, to settle scores and claim credit, George Thomas did something almost incomprehensible. He wrote nothing. He refused to write his memoirs. And he went further. He deliberately destroyed his own private papers, so no one could ever pick through them, so he could never be dragged into the post-war squabbling over who deserved what. He would not defend his own legacy. He seemed to believe, with a kind of granite integrity, that a man who spent his life doing right should not have to argue for it afterward, that the record should be allowed to speak for itself, and that to campaign for one's own glory was a dishonesty he would not stoop to. But the record does not speak for itself. That is the hard lesson at the center of this whole story. History is not a neutral scale that weighs each man's true worth. History is written, actively, by the men who show up to write it, who tell their version loudest and longest and leave their rivals out. Grant wrote his memoirs, and they are a masterpiece, and they are Grant's version. Sherman wrote his. The Confederate generals wrote theirs by the shelf full and built a whole mythology. And into the space where George Thomas's own voice should have been, there was only silence, a dignified, self-defeating silence. And the story got told by every man who fought in the war except the one who had, perhaps, earned the right most. And here is where his want and his need come apart, and it is the heart of him. What George Thomas wanted was almost painfully simple, to do his duty and to have that be enough. What he needed to understand, what he never did, and what may be the very thing that made him great, is that doing the work is never enough on its own. The credit doesn't flow to those who earn it. It flows to those who claim it. And George Thomas would not claim it. He would rather be forgotten by history than be seen, once, asking to be remembered. And so we come back to that portrait turned to face the wall in Virginia. Because the cruelest arithmetic of his life is this. He gave up his family for his country. He gave up his homeland for his oath. He saved his country's armies, repeatedly, at the peak of what a soldier can do. And in the final reckoning, the country he'd sacrificed everything to serve gave the lasting glory to louder men, while the homeland he'd sacrificed it against erased him from its memory as though he'd never been born. He lost his family for the Union, and the Union half forgot him. He was, in the most literal sense, a man without a home anywhere in history, too loyal for the South to honor, too silent for the North to celebrate. When George Thomas died in 1870, felled by a stroke, he died at his desk. And do you know what he was doing? Not writing his memoirs. Not setting down the glory of Chickamauga. He was writing a reply to a magazine article that had criticized him, defending not his fame, but simply the accuracy of the record, the plain facts of what had happened. He fell at that small, humble task, mid-sentence, still refusing to boast, still insisting on nothing more than the truth. And not one member of his Virginia family came to the funeral. He was buried far from the state that bore him, in Troy, New York, among his wife's people, because his own had cast him out and never took him back. There's a way to tell this story where it's simply sad, where George Thomas is only a victim, cheated by history, robbed by louder men, a good man who lost. And there's real truth in that version. But I don't believe it's the deepest truth of him. And I don't think it's why his soldiers loved him the way they did. Because the men who were on Horseshoe Ridge, who watched him hold that line while the world came apart, who charged up Missionary Ridge to take back their own name with their own blood, those men knew exactly what he was. And no memoir he declined to write, no credit that slid away, no portrait turned to a wall ever changed that by a single degree. His worth was never in the credit. His worth lived in the deed. He saved the army, whether or not the history books said so. He destroyed Hood's army, whether or not Grant trusted him to. He kept his word, whether or not his family ever forgave him for it. And that is the quiet, difficult thing this story leaves in your hands. We live in a world that rewards the loud The ones who claim, who broadcast, who campaign for their own legend. And it's dangerously easy to believe the reward is the thing that matters, that the credit is the point. George Thomas is the standing argument against it. He's proof that a man can do the greatest work of his generation and go almost entirely unthanked for it in his own lifetime. And be, in the only way that finally counts, wholly undiminished. He did not need to be remembered to have been right. He did not need the credit to have earned it. He only ever needed to hold the line. And he held it. History remembers the men who demanded to be remembered. It's far quicker to forget the ones who simply did the work, asked for nothing, and went home. For a century and a half, George Henry Thomas, the Rock of Chickamauga, the man who saved the Army of the Cumberland, the Virginian who gave up everything he loved to keep his word, has stood a step behind the famous names when by every honest measure he belongs right beside them. And maybe, in some small way, telling it like this puts him one step closer to where he belongs. Now I want to ask something of you, because so many of you carry this history in your blood. If you had an ancestor who served in the Civil War, and especially anyone who marched with the Army of the Cumberland, the men who stood on that ridge and stormed that mountain, tell us about him in the comments, his name, where he served, the story your family kept. Let's put those names back where people can see them and honor the men who never asked to be honored. And if the story of the general history overlooked moved you, the story of what really happened at Missionary Ridge, that charge up the mountain no one ordered, is on your screen now. Thank you for being here and for remembering the ones who never asked to be remembered. Subscribe, and we'll keep telling the stories worth keeping.